Hi, in this video we will learn how to secure your application backend using API keys. In short, API keys are used to identify and authorize front-end applications, typically end users. So whenever you create an application in Autogic, basically you generate RESTful APIs that can be called from your front-end applications. So you use these API keys in your front-end applications in order to call or consume the services exposed by your application. For this purpose, we will be creating a basic application. Let's create a new one. Let's give it a name like security. Sorry. The subdomain, that's fine. Free. Then I will be using the basic templates. Let's create the application. Okay, so let's get into the application. What I will do is the following. I will be creating a new model, a simple one. Let's call it test model. Timestamps enabled, and all the CRUD endpoints and services are created by default. Let's create this one. Then I will add a single integer field called number. That's it. Whenever you create a new application in Autogic automatically creates an environment for you, and in that environment it also creates a new API key that you can use. So let me delete this API key. We will later on create a new one, that's fine. So let's go back to here. Let's launch the tester. Let's wait a couple of seconds. Okay, so since we created the default CRUD endpoints, let's create an entry in the database. Let's put it 1. Let's run this thing. Okay, it successfully created the entry in the database. So how we use the API keys? The API keys are assigned to the endpoint. So if you go to the endpoint of your application, for this case we will be using the post method, create test model. If I click on this one, there is a checkbox here saying that API key required. So when I run this thing in tester, there was no API key requirement, so I successfully executed the service and it created an entry in the database. So if I mark this endpoint as API key required, if I update this one, if I come back here, if I try to run this post method again, let's see what will happen. It says that no API key found in authorization header or API key query parameters. So since we didn't provide any kind of authorization key, API key, then Autogic raised an error message. So how can we fix that one? What we need to do is the following. We need to come back to environments, select the environment that we are working on, API keys, new API key. So let's give it a name, key 1. This will be a full access key. I will get into the specific about what each of these means, but let's assume that right now we will be creating a full access key. This is our key. If I go back to the tester, if I go to the headers and change the API key in the authorization header, I will be using this key 1. Okay, body part, if I put here 2 this time, if I run this thing, it successfully created the entry in the database because we provided a valid API key. How this thing works in Postman? If I try to do the same thing in Postman, what do I need to do? Let's create a new entry here. It will be a post one. I need to get the endpoint URL. If I go back to Autogic, if I go back to my endpoints, this one, post one we are using, let me copy this one, go back to Postman again, let's paste it here. Authorization, the header part, we need to put here the authorization header, and the value will be the API key. Let's go back to, again, Autogic, environments, API keys. Okay, let's copy this one. Let's go back to Postman again. Let's paste this thing here. On the body one, we will be providing a JSON body. So this will be number. Let's put here 3. Let's run this thing. As you can see, it's successfully executed and created the record in the database. If I go back to Autogic, if I go to tester, let's run this one, get list of test model objects in the database. This is basically getting the list of entries like 1, 2, 3, everything is created in the database. So let's go back to the endpoints. Let's select all these endpoints, and let's say that we will be applying we will be marking them as API key required. Okay, let me run this thing. So all the API, all the endpoints are marked as API key required here, as you can see. So let me go back to the API key part again, and then I will do something like this. I will be marking this API key as a read-only, meaning that this API key can only be used with HTTP GET methods. So post, put, or delete HTTP methods will not be allowed in this case. Let's see how it will be behaving. Let's go back to the tester. If I run this thing again, it's working fine. No, isn't it? Let me see. Okay, sorry. I need to put here the API key. Okay. If I run this thing again, it's working fine. Let's see what will happen if I run the post one. The API key is there. If I try to run this thing again, it raises an error message saying that this API key can only be used with GET requests, because we marked this one as read-only. Only the GET methods, HTTP GET methods is allowed. There are some other options here. Okay, let's assume that we can say that, hey, this API key will only be used for creating a new entry and getting the list of entries in the database. Just for two. For the other three, let's say, endpoints, this API key cannot be used. Okay. Let's go back to here. Again, let's run this thing. Working fine. Let's run this thing. Let's put here 5. This is working fine. Okay, let me go back to here, pin this thing. Let me get the ID of this thing. And if I try to run the delete one, okay, this one ID here, headers, let's put the API key. Okay, let's run this thing. It says that the API key and delete method is not authorized, right? Because our API key has been marked as only the post and get methods are allowed. These endpoints are allowed, but we didn't allow the delete endpoint. If I add this thing here again, okay, let me update this thing. Right now the delete is also enabled. Sorry. If I run this thing again, as you can see, this is the first one and with the number 1. If I go back to here, if I put back to here, if I run this thing, successful, executed. If I come back here, this should be deleted. Let me refresh this thing. As you can see, it's deleted. So this is basically how you use the API keys. If I come back to here, you can also specify the other version, like, hey, everything, only these ones are allowed, or you can say that, hey, these ones are excluded, like you cannot do the delete operation, everything is as okay, you can use everything else, like the post, put, and get. You can also specify an end date, expiration date for the API key, saying that, hey, this API key is valid only for, let's say, 2 hours or 2 days or whatever. So you can specify the expiration date. And until this time, this API key will be valid. Beyond this date, the front ends or the users will not be able to use this API key. So those are the options that you can use for configuring API keys. As I mentioned, I mean, whenever you are using an HTTP client like Axios or Fetcher, what you need to do is you need to provide the API key in the authorization header, as shown in the Postman here. If you are using the AutoGIS client library, okay, if you go to the documentation, like the resources, client API guide, if I go to the installation part, initialization options, there are a couple of options that you can provide when you are creating the AutoGIS client. One of them is the API key. So besides the environment URL and client key, in the options part, you can also provide an API key that you created in your application in AutoGIS Designer. Where it is used, basically, you can call the cloud functions like the endpoints that are methods like get, post, put, delete. So whenever you call these methods, and if you provided the API key when creating the client library, then that API key will automatically be included in the authorization header of your let's say, cloud function calls. So that's it for API keys. I hope this helps. Thanks a lot for watching.